Could everybody please welcome Eric?
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. So the topic of my talk is Repudamaphobia, now with added vendor risk management methodology. So where this came from is, as a consultant, I often find myself in front of execs, and one of the favorite questions I ask, cliche as it is what keeps you awake at night? And what started coming up over and over again, I don't know if there was a podcast or a talk, but they also suddenly started talking about reputational damage. We're worried about reputational damage. We're worried about reputational risk. And talking about those things with a lot of my colleagues in the security industry, one of the interesting points of view that came up is what is reputational damage? Given that, if you look at what happened with Ashley Madison are doing better than ever. And if you look at the share prices of companies that have been through a breach, you see a momentary kind of drop and then a recovery. So what exactly is reputational damage, and is it something we should be worried about? And if we are worrying about it, are we doing the right things? Was kind of the question that I was trying to answer for myself. So is anyone in the room, lies awake at night worrying about reputational risk or reputational damage? Yeah, a few hands there. So in trying to define what reputational risk is, I realize we haven't transitioned to my slides yet. Whose job's that? Slides. I'm going to go back because it took me ages to draw that B. Right. So Repudamaphobia, an extreme or irrational fear or aversion towards the threat of reputational damage. So is it, as in my initial view, it was a bit irrational. So the font of all human knowledge, obviously, is Wikipedia. So it defines reputational risk as the loss resulting from damages to a firm's reputation, lost revenue, increased operating capital, regulatory costs, destruction of shareholder value, consequent to an adverse or potentially criminal event, even if the company is not found guilty. Makes sense. So let's jump straight into some statistics that talk to what that actually means. And one of the first things that came up when I started Googling this was this really interesting statistic, which completely shocked me, which is that 60% of hacked small and medium businesses go out of business within 6 months. That can't be right, I thought to myself. It turns out it's not. It was made up on the spot. So I dug a little bit deeper and I found some other interesting reports. And one of the interesting things I found was from Centrify. And what they found was that by interviewing people that worked in the industry, the IT practitioners, or 49% of them, saw brand diminishment as the biggest cost of a security incident. It's kind of interesting. That's quite a significant portion. But what was interesting to me was that the same survey showed that 71% of chief marketing officers believed that the biggest cost was that loss of brand value. So why is there a lack of consensus between the IT people and the marketing people about that cost of brand damage? And to me, we kind of alluded this in the previous panel. The previous panel alluded to the fact that, any publicity is good publicity. So in certain instances, ACCA, perhaps Ashley Madison, is that an opportunity for organizations? Not that I'm cynical enough to think that organizations would stage a breach for publicity, but is it something we can actually look at and make some meaningful inferences about? So what I came to realize with this kind of confusion around reputational damage is that I think it boils into two different things. So the first thing is what we know and what Wikipedia is talking to, which is damage of company reputation. So the shareholder value, the share price drops, the company goes bust. ACCA, the Distribute IT incident. We've got the regulatory costs of fines, compensation, the cleanup bill, so having to call Mandiant in a ridiculous amount of money to fix the problem. The legal, we're starting to see class actions by organizations that get breached, that are looking to sue the board or executives within the organization. Then we've got the things that are very much the go-to for a lot of organizations, which is that customer churn. So if we are breached, our customers will go to our competitors. You've got this really vague thing that people talk about, which is that loss of potential business, that opportunity cost, which is impossible to measure. There's so many variables, but it's definitely a thing. You've got your brand damage. You've got your poor customer outcome, which is essentially that those customers whose data is involved in that breach then suffer the consequence of things like identity theft, which is a bad look for a company. You've got staff attrition. So if your staff are getting absolutely smashed by complaints, then you're going to lose people. You've potentially got insurance premiums rising, or you've got the specter of insurance premiums appearing overnight because everyone asked the question, why weren't you insured? And then marketing offset, which I think is the increased marketing spend that you might want to put in place in order to get in front of a breach. So to repair some of that damage, you're going to have a bigger marketing bill potentially. And then obviously I always make a positive out of a negative unless you're an electrical engineer. The opportunity in a breach is obviously there's lots of free publicity and you get to improve security. Now, the other side that people don't really talk about but is incredibly salient is the damage of individual reputation. And this is what keeps people awake at night. But people don't want to say, when you sit in a room full of their peers, what I'm really worried about is my reputation. They talk about the company reputation, but it's kind of a code. And what they're worried about is obviously loss of income. They lose their job, they get no wages. If they have company shares, they're going to be devalued or they're not going to get to vest those shares. Difficulty finding next job, and their next job might be in the gig economy, which is to say they might be driving an Uber or delivering for Fedora. A loss of pride, your personal brand, the shame that comes from it, and the consequences, which, you know, there are cases where we're looking at prison time. If you think about the Banking Royal Commission, there's that potential for personal fines or prison time even. And then the opportunity, very, very slim, but you could cash in on that experience. If you're a security guy, you can say that, hey, I've got some battle scars here, I've been through this. You know, you could become an after-dinner speaker, perhaps, and you finally get to spend some time with your family, which is always a good thing. So this is, for me, where it gets fascinating, because now we can start to separate or decouple the idea of a company reputation and an individual reputation. And we start to think about what the sort of behaviors that an individual might exhibit in order to protect their own reputation that might not fare so well for the organization, or the sorts of behaviors an organization might exhibit that might put individual reputations at risk. So I think back to a time in my career where I was nominally in charge of security for a company where I felt very unsupported by the business. I was, you know, my job title was head of security and I had zero budget, zero resources. I couldn't get in front of the executives to talk about my fears. I literally was lying awake at night worrying. And given that I was an experienced person in the security industry, I found a really easy solution to that problem, which was to go and find another job. And in hindsight, that was a really good decision because I then saw lots of cyber incidents that befell that organization. Not purely because I left, but because they were the type of organization that didn't support the function of security. So individual reputation was very important for me. I just didn't realize what it was at the time or what to call it. So what I thought I'd do is I like to play games. So I was a fan of Top Trumps as a kid, so I created my own game called Top Dumps. Hasn't really panned out brilliantly, but what I've done is looked at some high-profile breaches that you've probably all heard about. I won't go into too much detail about them, but we'll look at what happened, and then we'll look at the aftermath as much as we can infer from what we can see from what was written about those things after the fact. So the first one was HB Gary. Essentially, Aaron Barr got a bit cocky, threatened to dox Anonymous, said they were unorganized and very unskilled. Anonymous took it upon themselves to prove that he was a little bit wrong, pwned them up using a crappy CMS with MD5 passwords that were reused, of course. What was interesting is that HB Gary was a security company. They were doing some very interesting, sneaky beaky things that they couldn't really talk about. So they got hacked really badly. It was a security company, which is a bad thing. But they got awesome free publicity, and suddenly everyone was talking about what HB Gary did. And they were talking about the things that HB Gary couldn't really do. HB Gary couldn't talk about the fact they were working with the NSA, but the journalists who were reporting on the story did. HB Gary got sold for an awful lot of money. So was this hack a really bad thing or a really, really good thing? The jury's still out. I'm sure it wouldn't be something they'd repeat. But from a reputational damage or reputational perspective, it wasn't a clear-cut bad thing, right? Next one It was Hacking Team. So Hacking Team got spectacularly owned by a guy calling himself Phineas Fisher. Went on to write a very popular blog post exactly how he did it, dropped the source code of their products, including Oday on the web, exposes the customers, including trouble tickets logged by some very interesting organizations, some of them local. They got hacked. It was a security company. It's bad look. They got awesome free publicity. And they were back up and running and advertising the fact that they were better and stronger the second time around within 9 months. So again, not that clear cut. Next one that was interesting was Uber. We've all read about Uber. They got hacked by some guys who effectively extorted them, tried to extort them for $100,000 US. They paid the $100,000 and then tried to make it look like a bug bounty payment and got the hackers to sign an NDA and agree to delete all the data and tried to brush it under the carpet for a year before making a public announcement. So they got caught trying to make it look like a bug bounty. Not a good look. Only cost them $100,000. Now, given that it's been valued at around 68 million, that's pretty much chump change. So I think that's a plus. And the CISO got fired. He's on LinkedIn at the moment as a self-employed consultant, which is as close to an Uber driver as you can get. So not really a great outcome for them, but Uber is still in business. They're still doing fantastically well. We can't look at the share price, unfortunately, but I think that they have other problems with their reputation that probably overshadowed them about the problems with their paying their drivers and online Twitter storms complaining about them as a company. But I don't think the hack was that big a deal for them. Next one that's interesting, not a breach, but it's a local significance. And the reason I want to talk about this one is because not that the census or the Australian Bureau of Statistics really suffered reputational damage, but IBM, who were the contractor that were delivering this, got thrown under the bus by Malcolm Turnbull, no less. So in the days following the outcome, they were blamed, completely thrown under the bus. They agreed to pay $30 million in compensation, admitted mea culpa, which is a pretty significant amount of money, until you realize that their revenue in that year was 21.8 billion, which suddenly $30 million is not a lot of issues. Anyone from IBM in? You can decide for yourself whether a 30 million compensation was actually a thumb up or a thumb down. What's interesting here is that if you look at the stock price of IBM between the census night, so everyone got online on the 9th, there wasn't any real significant change to the stock price until that big spike there. I never really got to the bottom of what that was. I assume that Watson managed to get more Tinder dates than a real IBM engineer or something. But there wasn't anything. It's almost as if the market doesn't really care about what happened and the adverse publicity. And then they agreed to pay 30 million in compensation. Their stock price goes up, not down. So not that significant. So why are we all lying awake worrying about this stuff, right? Okay, well, Equifax. So Equifax is interesting. Largest and most costly breach in history. Their stock fell 35% in the days following the notification. The CIO and the chief security officer retire to spend more time with their family. The CEO retires, not so good. CEO gets a 90 mil payout. Yay, I think that's a green thumb for me. That might have been a fraction of his wages, but that probably kept him out of an Uber for a while. So let's have a look at what happened with the share price over this event. So Apache Struts vulnerability was identified there. The patch became available. Then in mid-May, there was the first breach. Then the breach was detected. They patched the system very quickly. Then within days, 4 of the execs at Equifax sell their shares or sell a large percentage of their shares. Then in the following days, they announced the breach. Suddenly, now we see what we're talking about with this share price. Straight away, the share price drops through the floor because Equifax are holding a very large amount of personal data. Then the CISO and the CIO announced their retirement effectively immediately. And suddenly we see that the market reacts to that, which is interesting. Then the CEO decides to retire and take a $1 million payout, and the stock starts to kind of balance out. And the footnote here is that Equifax, after a very extensive internal investigation, announced that there were no wrongdoings in the executive share trades. It turns out that those share trades were actually sort of planned and scheduled long before they knew that the breach. So it was just unfortunate timing. But it's still interesting and caused a bit of a stir. So here is the best palpable evidence that a breach of this magnitude actually does affect the share price. However, this is a real earth-shattering breach. Everyone's still awake? So target, easy target. Hackers were able to infiltrate the network by stealing credentials from their heating and ventilation company, famously. It took a while, but 40 million credit card numbers went on holiday to Moscow, which is a bad look for Target. The CEO lost his job very quickly. The total cost of this breach has been calculated at $202 million. The stock price is still not recovered. But they only had to pay $18 million in settlement claims. So given that that's a small percentage of that, but that is definitely a pretty extensive breach. So this is what the timeline looks like. So we can see that the services were hacked. The attackers break in and test the malware on the POS machines. They begin to collect the credit card data. They begin to exfil the data. The Department of Justice notify them, and then within a few days, they've removed the malware. Then Krebs breaks the story at about the same time, which is, there's not a significant drop after that happened, which is kind of surprising. Then there's the subsequent story about the additional 70 million customers affected, and it starts to go right downhill. And around about that time, they laid off 475 employees. That wasn't the security team, that was just because they were having problems already. They worked out the costs were about 200 million. And then eventually, after a few months, they removed the CEO, which actually makes the stock price carry on plummeting, or actually causes it to plummet. So they certainly, that wasn't a silver bullet for them. Next one, my favorite breach of all time. I could talk for hours about this one. So Avid Life Media, or as we know, Ashley Madison. So the data gets dumped. This was essentially an extortion or a hacktivism attack. They were attacked, the data was stolen, the attackers gave them an ultimatum to close down, otherwise they were going to start releasing the data, and Ashley Madison thought they could ride it out somehow. Within that data, which is a very rich database, is the information that then subsequently gets mined by researchers. And it looks a lot like the whole thing was a scam. Something like 0.02% of the women on there were actually real women rather than bots. And essentially what they were doing is getting lonely guys to pay to talk to robots. The planned IPO the whole sort of scam, I think, was a bit of a, let's sell this to some naive venture capitalists. So that was completely derailed. Biderman retires eventually. The Canadians attribute several suicides to the breach, which is pretty severe in terms of reputational damage. There's a $567 million class action is launched against them. However, they're able to rebrand themselves as Ruby Corp and then settle for $11.2 million, which is a huge win for them. And in 2017, last year, they commissioned Ernst & Young to write a report which claimed that they had 15,000 new users a day. So Ashley Madison is now doing far better than it ever was and is on track for another IPO, which is kind of interesting. So from a company reputation, just great. For the personal reputation of Noel Biderman, still a self-employed consultant, might be driving an Uber or might be delivering your Deliveroo anytime soon. So that brings me to kind of the key takeaways from the research that I've done. Firstly, you need to understand the difference between the personal and the organizational reputation. They're two different but inextricably linked things. The second, if you're going to plan for, and as you should, for reputational damage and what it means for your organization, you should plan in terms of both your organization and for the key individuals who are likely to suffer this, so that you can get inside their minds and start to look at their likely behaviors. So this executive officers, the security officer, marketing officer, and so on and so forth, and find out what their exposure and what their motivations are likely to be so that you can get in front of that planet. For the CISO specifically, security is all about adopting a defensible position. So that's how you protect your personal reputation, and that is a position that bodes well for the organization as well as yourself. So if you are the type of guy who thinks, hey, who uses AV? No, it doesn't really work. We're going to be the company that doesn't use AV, and you subsequently get owned because you didn't use AV, then that's not a defensible position. Turns out that trying to cover up the breach or pretend it's a bug bounty after the fact is not a defensible position. It turns out that sacking people right after the fact might not be the silver bullet. So if your go-to response to a big breach is just to start canning people, think about the impact of that, because it's not always what you might hope for. And I promised you a vendor risk methodology. So what I've realized from this is if you want a secure company today, find a company that was hacked last month. I think it's kind of fascinating that I was in the middle of an engagement with an organization that were procuring services from an MSP that got very publicly hacked, and they came to me and said, do we need to withdraw from this deal? And I was kind of like, no, double down. This is going to be the securest company. By the time that you implement them, they are going to be so secure, it's going to be funny. And last point, sleep well. And there you go. Any questions? Stunned silence.
Is anybody awake? Oh, good. We have one awake person in the room.
You mentioned the effect on IBM for the census fail. What do you think the reputational damage was on the ABS?
I think that it was very embarrassing for them, but I think that it was handled very badly. I think that having the Prime Minister sort of apportioning blame very early on was a really bad look. But I don't think, from an organisation, I don't think they necessarily suffered hugely. Other than that initial embarrassment, there's probably a bit of lost face for the executives in the organisation. But it's not an organisation that it's competing with other organisations. So nobody's going to churn. Nobody's going to, potentially people might say, I'm not going to answer the census next time because I don't trust them to do the right thing. But it was an availability thing, not a security thing. So I think they got away scot-free, considering.
So you'd say, much like we were discussing in the last session, that reputation is going to be more a fact of how you respond or how you position something, reputational damage, rather than the fact that something happened.
Absolutely. There was a really interesting quote by Raj Bhatia, who was the Chief Technology Officer at Ashley Madison, that came from an email he sent to Noel Biderman before this kicked off, that was then publicly sort of pushed through the press, which was, people are no longer interested in the fact that you've been breached as an organization. What they're interested in is how you respond. If you look at the organizations that have been hacked, the Googles, the Lockheed Martins, the Rolls-Royce, the Cisco's, you're joining a very august panel. There's no shame to be had, coupled with the fact that the advent of the breach notification has meant that a lot of us, certainly we saw this happen in California, have breach fatigue. Then, okay, another one. You just shrug. So I think, how you handle it is a big thing, and the way you do that well is planning it and giving it some forethought.
So the cynic in me says that in reality, what you should do is, if you're going to not do the best job you possibly can, make sure you've got deep pockets to hire the right company after the fact, whether it be marketing or remediation or incident response.
Yeah, get a PR company.
Hi, probably more of an observation than a question, but I think in terms of impact with stats, it was the knock-on effect to all the other government agencies afterwards and their CIOs and CEOs wanting to avoid being the next stats.
Yep.
It was the biggest impact rather than the impact on the Bureau itself.
Yeah, so the cost of doing, a lot of people waking up to the fact they should have been doing things, and so it was good for me as a security consultant, because after those events we get lots of phone calls. Hey, we've seen this, the CEOs, I've got in the lift with the CEO and he's asked me about this, or the board's asking curly questions about this. So security consultant, we love these breaches because they bring what we do into the boardroom and people have those conversations. I think we've reached that level now where everyone's asking the right questions. For 10 years in cyber, we've been saying the board don't get it, the board don't ask the right questions. Now that's happening and we're scrabbling around trying to supply the right answers to those questions.
Excellent. Keep them coming. We've got 10 more minutes for questions.
Oh, sorry.
So you talked about a point at which the CSO or the CISO should have a defensible position. If you've been unable to actually enact that in the business, at what point should you throw your company under the bus, and how do you protect your personal brand if you get to the point where your company's trying to throw you under the bus?
That's interesting, and this is precisely what happened to me, and the reaction I took at that time, I was a little bit younger and a little bit less experienced, was to walk away. I found another job because I knew that there was a really good chance bad things were going to happen, and I was going to be looking for a job, and they were like, where have you come from? What did you do? Oh, we've read about them. Don't call us. If I'd react in the same way, I think I'd have more, because I've got a little bit more, you can't tell, but I've got a bit more grey hair now, I'm a bit older, a bit more experienced. I think I'd have enough gravitas to get the attention of the people in the organization now. Maybe I'm jaded because I'm a consultant, so I tend to get, because my opinion is paid for, it tends to carry a bit more weight now. I think that right now people are amenable to listening, and there are fewer organizations or people within organizations that I talk to that were in the position I felt in, which is they didn't care. Security wasn't a thing for them. What they cared about was availability. They weren't interested in confidentiality. I think there are fewer cases like that around, but if you are really if your reputation is on the line and the organization you work for is not supporting you, and you try and you fail to get that attention and get any traction, then yeah, my advice would be really to think about moving on. And think about that from an organizational perspective. If you are the CEO of an organization and you have security people working for you and you're not supporting them, what is the outcome of those, attrition of those people in the climate that we have? We have a shortage of people. They're hard to replace. You lose an awful lot of knowledge when those people depart. So listen to those people.
Given we're all selfish humans, how do we manage our own personal reputation when you're in a difficult situation?
Giving it some forethought and having that defensible position. Having stuff in writing, maybe. Not that you need to be one of those people who just goes around CCing everyone and covering your ass. But yeah, have that sort of internal dialogue. What would this look like if bad things happened? How would, do I have a strong position? Have I done the right thing? If you go through those questions in your mind and the answer is you're not happy with the answers you're giving yourself, then you need to get to work the following day and start thinking about that and prioritizing that. So the way I look at security is very much, it's simply a list of things. So the first job is compiling that list of things. The second part is understanding that you're never going to have the time, the money, and the resources to knock over all those things. So it's moving the things that need to be at the top of that list. And really the question I had for myself at the beginning of this wasn't so much that is reputational damage a thing we should be worried about. It's where do we put it on that list? And is reputational damage itself the end game that we're trying to stop, or do we need to unpack it a little bit and address some of those specific things? And you end up at that, yes, it is definitely something we need to be worried about, but it depends on the organization whether that is the first and only thing you're worried about, and that generally, is that what should be keeping you awake at night, or are there other things you should be thinking about?
You raised the issue earlier of reputational damage control for an organisation largely falling to people managing their own personal reputation. Would you consider that act actually to be potentially detrimental to most organisations?
Yeah, well, I think that's what happened in the case of Uber, where somebody decided to try and sweep it under the carpet and pretend it was a bug bounty. I think that was seeded in personal pride and not wanting to admit that the company had been hacked and go public with it. So I think that's what I was kind of alluding to, where I said thinking about those behaviours that individuals might exhibit that end up bad for the company. And I think there's lots of cases of that where people cover their own ass. Or I mean, simply, I guess you could say that about people simply walking away, throwing their hands in the air at the first thing. This is too hard. Nobody listens to me. I'm off.
Unless we have any other questions, could everybody please thank Eric for this interesting discussion?
Thank you.